Shalosio Yatzarel and sojourners. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Unehiya, reporting live on behalf of, as usual, the master of the sacred wind. And it is the day after Thanksgiving. The day after Thanksgiving. So I'm eager to see what kind of energy you guys are coming in with. Not in terms of what kind of energy you have left after the itis from all that you've eaten or lack thereof. But what I mean is, what is the energy that you bring to the table? What is the vibe? What is the general vibration? What is the general frequency of your vibration coming into the day after Thanksgiving? This isn't going to be an overly spiritual video or anything like that. I really just want to hang a couple thoughts on your mind and see how you feel about these things. In particular, there's one thing I wanted to share as a clip that I wanted to share with you guys. But I have to provide some context. I have to provide some context for the clip. And also, I have to kind of, I suppose, introduce myself as well, or at least give you some understanding of the relevant parts of my identity to this conversation. So I'm not going to take very long doing any of that, and then I'm just going to get right to it. Chiefly, first and foremost, it's important to understand going into this that I identify as an American Indian. I am a descendant of Creek Indian freedmen, and it's actually accounting for about 5 of 16 parts of my bloodline, and there's another quarter of my bloodline that is Cherokee as well. So that is more than half. With that alone. In this particular video, I'm not going to be, in other videos I have and will explored the other facets of my identity, but I want to focus right there for a second, because I want to make sure that that it's understood where I'm coming from here. So that people understand what's up with everything that I have to say. And again, it's not going to take long. I do acknowledge myself. I acknowledge that there is a bloodline for myself. There is a bloodline coming from Africa. And I also recognize that there is some controversy over people of my complexion and their space in the Abo community. As I've said many times before, my great-grandmother on my mother's side, my maternal great-grandmother, did grow up on the Muskogee Reservation in Oklahoma. And I am one of those people who, is very, 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 very pro genealogy. Yes, I've done my genealogy and am continuing to do it, because there's always more work to do in genealogy, you come to find, when you start to get further and further back for multiple generations. And so for all of those out there who you hear talking about genealogy, I'm 1000% on their side about that. But I also know that that the Abo community has struggled to find a way to bridge the gap between the various segments of what are now termed Native Americans and the Native American community. So I get that. This is not going to fully broach that subject right this second, but later I'm on the other side of the clip I wanted to show you. I'm going to address that as well. Anyway, I just wanted to give that a little context. And then also, before I go into the clip, or even go any further, I think it's important that we offer an invocation. Which, yes, I understand. I did say that this isn't going to be like a very spiritual stream or anything, and it's not a spiritual conversation so much. Although all things are spiritual and all things are political, that's what I believe. Both of those statements are true. But by invocation, I do mean prayer. I will not be, I will be addressing the invocation, very short invocation. I'm gonna keep it very brief. And you don't even really need to join me in it, because I will be praying to the master of the sacred wind, and many of you, I'm sure, would not, and feel free, if it makes you more comfortable, to pray on your own to whomever you may pray to, or don't pray, whatever. It's perfectly fine. We definitely want to welcome all belief systems here today, but I do at the same time want to expose you to a culture that is not your own. If this is not your own, then that's the idea. The whole point of a lot of this conversation is to talk about why that's necessary. And you need to really think about why you're not comfortable, if you're not comfortable, why you're not comfortable with sitting in the moment while somebody else directs invocation to an entity that you do not know, or that you do not acknowledge, that you disagree with, any of that. Sit in that for a moment. Just sit in that for a moment. This would be an excellent opportunity to do so. I'm just going to say this really quickly. All right. I'm not gonna drag it out or anything. It'll be real quick. So just whatever your preference is, and this is also providing more time for anyone else who wants to join the stream, for more viewers to join the stream. Just kind of bask in the moment for a second, and Practice mindfulness at the very least. Meditate on gratefulness. Meditate on thankfulness, right? Right? I'll do my thing, you do your thing. Just real quick. Hisakere mesi. Maro inka huerat osi olikere rako macha yetunks. Emani ke likere apo chareka rako champa. Taso enhirteta hasawa. I think that for many of you, it can be somewhat uncomfortable. That's okay. It is what it is. But we're going to talk about that. Let's kind of broach that subject because it directly relates to the topic of conversation here, which is really pertaining to this clip that I think speaks volumes about what America can be. And all my fellow Americans are welcome here, regardless of skin color, regardless of common creed, spiritual beliefs, political bent, whatever it may have you. We're not going to let any of those things interfere with the conversation. That's the most important part. Listen, I want to expose that to you. Remember, Christians have been going around the world, nothing against Christianity at all, whatsoever. Christians have been going around the world historically, forcing others to be exposed to their beliefs, which is kind of the point of evangelism, right? That's the point. And one has to wonder, at what point do we acknowledge the ills? And I know that many of you already have acknowledged this. I know that, of course, lots of you went into Thanksgiving Day. You came into this holiday already having a robust understanding of the history of the holiday, or at least you understand what's problematic about it generally. Right? So I'm not even tripping about that. It's not that I think that, that it's not like this conversation is meant for the ignorant here. Quite the contrary, actually. And yeah, I want to be able to acknowledge some things about the way all of us think and the way all of us feel and what resonates with your spirit, regardless of whether you believe in spirit or not. Listen, so for example, think about this. Think about it this way. I'm trying to come at this from as non-controversial an angle as possible. Atonement. Atonement is an idea that I think we all generally understand in one way or another. But let's take it from a Hindu perspective. In Hinduism, I think the best way to look at this would be Sanchita karma. Sanchita karma is the specific mode of karma that pertains to the sum total of your past experiences or your past deeds as being net negative or net positive. And depending on whether it's net negative or net positive, you incur, specific outcomes in the future. Let's put it that way. And so, this has been summed up by many in various ways. You reap what you sow and all of those kinds of things. It would seem that there is this inherent understanding coming from all walks of life about how this thing works. The human experience has trended toward the understanding that basically do good, get good, do bad, get bad, right? And you have to wonder why it is that so many different ethnic groups and so many different ideologies throughout history have had this understanding in one way or another. Maybe not exactly the same way, but basically, if you're in a net negative, if your sanchita is net negative karma, the understanding is, the idea is, you're gonna have to pay for that in some way just to break even. And then to get good, you would have to do good beyond that thereafter, after having paid for it, after having paid for the bad that you've done, right? So think about that. And then look at the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Understand that we have a similar concept coming from that direction as well, right? To atone, if I ask you what atonement is from an Abrahamic perspective, many are going to say, there's atonement in Christianity is sacrifice, right? You have to sacrifice something. A sacrifice had to be made in order to pay for all the sin, right? Which, frankly, is not actually the case. So if we look at the Tanakh, in Christianity called the Old Testament, we see a contrary perspective. And this is, by the way, directly linked to why Jews struggle to have a debate with Christians, because you're doing like this. You're not arguing on the same plane. The same things don't mean the same thing to each of you. You have semantic differences on the very same terms you're using, that the terms you share, right? Well, this is why. This is why. If you look in Sefer Bamidbar, which is the fourth of 5 books that make up Torah, which is the teachings that begin the Tanakh, right? What does it actually say? You find in this is the book of Numbers, chapter 5. If If you look in chapter 5, verses 5, 6, and 7 show you Yahweh speaking to Moses and telling Moses, she says to Moses, speak unto the children of Israel. I'm reading this. Speak unto the children of Israel. And then she proceeds to tell Moses what to say to the children of Israel, which is, when a man or woman shall commit any sin that man commit, to do trespass against Yahweh, and that person be guilty, then they shall confess their sin which they have done, and he shall recompense his trespass with the principal thereof, and add unto it the fifth part thereof, and give it unto him against whom he hath trespassed. So, if you sin against your fellow man, against your fellow human, if human beings sin against other human beings, the law of the singularity of existence, which is what Yahweh means, existence, the singularity of existence, the sum of all existence. In other words, nature in its broadest sense, not just nature in the sense of ecosystems on this planet, but nature, nature for the entire universe. Yahweh is the universe. You understand that, right? And the universe is telling Moshe to tell the Israelites that the way she operates, the way nature operates, is if you transgress, if you sin as a human being against another human being, then first you have to confess that sin. In other words, you have to admit it. You have to admit that you've done wrong, that you've wronged someone. And you have to admit it to the tune that it is true. Not admit a piece of it, but admit it in its wholeness, in its fullness. First, you must admit it fully, with no equivocation. And then you have to correct it. You have to compensate, recompense, it says in the King James Version of the Bible for Christians reading. And I'm reading in the King James Version is why I say that. You have to compensate them for the damages done by your sin, and add to that compensation 20% interest in whatever way that can be calculated. Because of course the damages are oftentimes not monetary, but the idea is that you somehow pay them back in full plus interest. The reason this is interesting also is because, of course, we have a lot of equivocation historically in this country over, first of all, how bad the atrocities ever even were. The atrocities against the Aborigine and the atrocities against the slave brought from Africa. Indeed, both of them have a grievance that goes under-acknowledged by the colonizer. So you'll have some who can at least admit that the crimes were committed. These were crimes against humanity, and that can be admitted. Then you have others who can't even do that. They cannot admit it, or they admit a piece of it, but not it in its fullness. You see what I'm saying? Right? So that's, and we all understand this. So, and these are the things that, that woke white folk are already thinking about going into Thanksgiving, right? You already understand this to be the problem. But this also comes into play with reparations. And I'm not going to go into the whole discussion on reparations for slavery. I'm not going to go into the whole discussion on reparations for slavery, but this is that. This is that. Just to be sure, it's in Torah and it's very clear. And slavery, chattel slavery as an institution in the history of the United States of America was systemically perpetuated and perpetrated in the first place by Christians and Jews. Now, of course, the Arab slave trade was before that, and there's, that history in Africa and in the Middle East, and that was perpetrated by Muslims. But I'm just focusing on America. This is American history, and in American history, Christians and Jews did the deed. But atonement is exactly that, the compensation part. First is confession, and then that second part is atonement. Notice, atonement is not sacrifice here. This is how you atone. You atone by fixing it. You fix it. That's how you atone for your sin. Your sin did damage, and you must repair the sin, the damage of the sin. That's atonement. That's true atonement. The sacrifice that everybody is so up in arms about is just a ritual. And the ritual has its place and its purpose, which is to train the mind. We'll talk about that in a subsequent video. But the point is, sacrifice is not it. Actual atonement is fixing the problem that you caused, plus interest. So, I say all that to say, that these are the things that some white folk were thinking about when they went into Thanksgiving. This is why I want to throw you a clip that demonstrates as much. And I want you to see how some white people were thinking. Some white folk think differently than other white folk. That's the point I'm trying to say. Some white folk think differently than other white folk. And I just want to demonstrate that. See if we can't get some clarity on all this.
I see white Americans as visitors on this land. I came out when I was still pretty young, so I've experienced what it's like to be marginalized, but I've seen how much worse it can be for people who have to wear their differences on their skin, For me, Thanksgiving's more about giving thanks to Native Americans, because we're guests here to this despite our ancestors raping, pillaging, and pitting the tribes against each other. If there's anyone we should be thanking for us being here, it's the Native Americans for being Americans, supporting us in developing all this. That's why I donated to Unehiya this year. They advocate for Native American slave descendants, particularly for the Afro-Indigenous people. Even among Native Americans, they still get excluded from history and the modern day. Giving to Unehiya is a simple way to give back to the Native American community and target the wounds that seem to be healing the slowest. I'm Carla, and I like Unehiya because they're solving a unique problem for the people who deserve our support right in our backyard.
Remember also that it's a common argument from, frankly, Christian conservatives most of the time, that they, as living, breathing, Euro-American people today shouldn't be held accountable for any of what their ancestors did in the process of colonization and in the process of institutionalizing slavery. They believe and proclaim vehemently and with boldness and with vigor that they should not be held accountable for those things because they are not their forefathers. But they themselves are Christian, which means they do ascribe to the teachings of the Bible. Well, the teachings of the Bible would be the Torah. Torah literally means teachings. And much of the teachings are of the law, right? The commandments. The third commandment out of the most famous 10. The third commandment itself reads as follows. You can find this in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. It says, "Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them." To whom? It says, it's talking about who it was just talking about in the verse before this. The previous commandment was saying, don't make graven images, don't make idols to any of the things you see in the heavens, which is just the sky. So it's talking about stars and planets and all of those things that you see, including the sun and the moon. Do not make idols to represent those things. Do not make idols to represent anything under the earth or in the water. Do not make, creatures of the sea, creatures of the land, anything like that. Do not make idols of any of those things. Just don't make any idols of anything anywhere is what it was saying in the second commandment. Well, this is the third commandment saying also, do not bow yourself down to any of those things. And it says, nor serve them. Don't bow yourself down to those things. Don't serve those things. Why? Because I, Yahweh Elohim, am a jealous Elohim, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation. So the point is, Yahweh is literally saying that your transgressions, for which you have not atoned, are going to incur consequences, and those consequences fall upon not only you, but also your children, your children's children, your children's children's children, your children's 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 children. This is where the concept of generational curses comes from, at least from an Abrahamic standpoint, when it comes to Abrahamic religions. This is what that means. This is what that means. So to put this more simply and more acutely, according to your own faith, you are actually indeed responsible for what your ancestors did to mine. That's from the same Bible that you beat my ancestors over the head with when you got here. When you came, that's what you did. You gave us this. You forced us to learn it, and we have. This is what it says. Now, I just bring that up to point out there are many who do not confess. They don't admit what their ancestors have done. They do not atone for anything, and largely they don't do any of these things because they do not hold themselves accountable for any of these things. You see what I'm saying? They don't hold themselves accountable. You just don't believe you're responsible. And you don't believe that we should make anything of it with you. It has nothing to do with you, you say. So this is something, that's the other end of the spectrum. But we have some, like we saw in the clip, who want to take this as an opportunity, use Thanksgiving as an opportunity to give thanks to the American Indian. Why? It's not a new concept. It's not a new concept. Why should you be thankful to the American Indian? Because you are, in fact, an immigrant here. This is why some woke white folk have empathy for immigrants from other countries trying to come here, because they see themselves in the Hispanic. They see themselves in the Arab. They see themselves in the East Indian. So that's laudable. That's laudable. It really is. And I get it. I get it, and I can appreciate what you're trying to do. Immigration policy and the debates over it are largely attributable to this ideological discourse and the unwillingness of either side to see the points of either side. So this is at the heart of that. I want to also look at what Abraham Lincoln said in a speech, where, and this is generally thought to be the speech that made Thanksgiving Day what it is today. Abraham Lincoln essentially created the Thanksgiving Day that you celebrate, and that you observe, and that you acknowledge, and that you just enjoyed. And his stance, I think, is pretty clear. In fact, let me see if I can read this. These are Abraham Lincoln's words. I'm just reading to you straight out of the transcript of the speech, which is now historic. He said, "No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand. No, let me start over. No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things." What great things is he talking about? He just gave this long portion of his speech to praising the land for its beautiful ecosystems and healthy environment, sustaining the American populace, the American society. And he's saying no human is responsible for those things. They just naturally are, right? No human counsel hath devised, nor hath any mortal hand worked out these great things. They are the gracious gifts of the highest God, who, while dealing with us in anger for our sins, hath nevertheless remembered mercy, it has seemed to me fit and proper that they should be solemnly, reverently, and gratefully acknowledged as with one heart and voice by the whole American people. I do therefore invite my fellow citizens in every part of the United States, and also those who are at sea and those who are sojourning in foreign lands, to set apart and observe the last Thursday of November next, as a day of thanksgiving and praise to our beneficent Father who dwelleth in the heavens. If you understand what he's saying, then you understand that he is actually taking accountability, at least in his words here. He's taking accountability in the sense that he acknowledges that these are sins. Now, that is a light confession because, of course, he is not really enumerating the sins, but still, he is acknowledging the sins collectively as quickly as possible so as not to dwell on them, but he is acknowledging them and saying that the purpose of observing Thanksgiving Day is to give thanks to the Most High, or he says the highest God. Elyon is how you say that in Hebrew, right? This is the creator. This is source of all things, the singularity of existence. Yahweh, Yahweh Elohim, Elyon. Not Jesus. Notice he doesn't say Jesus. And I'm not trying to, of course he was a Christian. He was a Christian. So he could have said Jesus, but he didn't. No. He's reaching above that to the highest God. And Thanksgiving Day is meant to thank that highest God, the source of all things. To thank Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Elohenu, for not forcibly, violently removing Euro-Americans from the land. That's essentially what he's saying here. Because for their sins, they shouldn't get to still enjoy all of this. And he's acknowledging that. And he is counting it as mercy that this country is allowed to continue to develop on this land. He deems it fit and proper to view it that way. And I deem it equally fit and proper to view it that way. And so I want to point backward to Unehiya, which is what the first clip the first clip was about. We were able to witness a Euro-American citizen speaking about what they chose to use Thanksgiving for and how they chose to give thanks. Because there are many who sit around a table and consider it to be a day where they are supposed to be thankful for their family and friends, thankful for the opportunity to gather together. And then you're thankful for all of these things, and that's all good. There's nothing wrong with being thankful for your family and friends, but please understand please understand that in you being thankful for your family and friends, that's not actually what this day was declared to be. It was declared to be for something else, that you be thankful for something else. Be thankful that you're even here. Because then you're approaching everything with the right mindset. You approach the Indian with the right mindset. You approach the African with the right mindset. And I speak for them both. I speak for them both when I say so. And so that is the key here. That is the key. I want to point backward to that because it is an excellent way to give back. This isn't just giving back to the quote unquote Native American society in general. It's even more pointed than that. By finding within the broader Abo community here in North America, to isolate a more specific group that is marginalized even within the indigenous community. Even within the indigenous community, you have margins of that society. That society has its own margins. And frankly, the Indian freedman occupies those margins consistently. And this is the whole reason I support Unehiya. This is the whole reason why I participate in Unehiya as much as I do, and why you hear me speak about it on this channel. For those of you who my core followers know what I'm talking about, because I've talked about it before, which is precisely now what I'm about to show you. I want to direct you toward the times when I have spoken about this, and also to give you a clearer explanation on what Unehiya actually is. I want to give you an explanation on that. I want you to have the chance to thoroughly understand the position that the Negro is in. And it's key, because in reality, there are many who feel that we should not have a claim to indigeneity. And they themselves who think this way are Native Americans who descend from people that look a lot more like me than they want to admit. But they don't want us. They don't want the freedmen to be fully acknowledged as Indian. And that's been a fight in so many tribes for so long, demonstrating how many levels there are to ideological colonization. They turn on their own people. Now, there is extreme colorism and racism amongst Native Americans. That's what's happening. And so that's what needs to be fixed. That needs to be fixed. Something needs to be done about that. Unehiya is one of the few organizations out here doing something about it. So it is more than worthwhile to help the Indian solve his own problem. There are other crises that you can also support. The American Indian does need other forms of support. You know that many of you may know that many Aboriginal communities here in North America are in need of as many lifelines as possible when it comes to the substance abuse disorder epidemic that that America as a whole has been experiencing. All of this country has been writhing in agony over that particular issue, but it's the Aboriginal community that has been hit perhaps the hardest statistically. And I only give that as an example, one of many, of course, of the kinds of problems you might seek to help with, right? Because this is how you atone. This is how you atone, especially in lieu of reparations for the enslaved. You've got to be able to do something. You got to think of what can I myself do? And that's even if you are Indian. Listen, if you're Indian, if you are indigenous and your skin, your complexion does not look like mine, you must also share the burden of the colonizer in atoning for these sins. Because that also is in you. And for most Native Americans, the truth is, just being honest, the truth is, for most Native Americans, the blood of the colonizer is more in you than the blood of the Indian at this point. That's why blood quantum as a system even exists. But I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I just want to introduce as many people as possible to the understanding that we're here too. We're here. And I think that Unehiya represents an amazing opportunity for you to give back. To give back. Humanity as a whole is meant to give back to the land, first and foremost, to the land and to its waters. And that's because the elements, or Elohim, as they are called, the elements are sacred. And they have given to us, which is precisely why it is disrespectful to pray to them constantly asking for things. As often as possible, I attempt to pray and ask for nothing, but instead thank, because the elements, Elohim, have given us everything we need already. The sacred wind, the master of the sacred wind, has put that sacred wind within us. That is breath. When they take that breath back, that is your time to return to the soil from whence we all come. So think about that. These elements are responsible for you, and you are responsible for them. That is the balance that existence, Yahweh, the universe, whatever you want to call her, has established. Unehiya, I want to show you Unehiya. There's a link in the description for you to for you to support as well. You can do that, and I hope that you will. You know, I understand, of course, that the economic circumstance we face right now is not a good one. Inflation has not really rounded the corner at all. And the president-elect has already spoken of his plan and even elucidated details of that plan to increase tariffs on countries that are responsible for a lot of the goods and services that we consider basic and fundamental needs to our lifestyle today, to a modern lifestyle today. So of course, costs are about to only increase even further for all kinds of things. And so these are all concerns that I fully understand why someone might, these are concerns that I fully understand might cause someone to feel that they are in a position right now where they just don't have it to give. But if there is anything you're able to give, please do. Because I want you to see, in just a minute, you're about to see, for those who haven't seen, because perhaps, most likely because you're new to my channel. For those who haven't seen, you're about to see what you would be giving back for. And your donations would actually go toward. So I'm going to show you that, and then I'm going to let you go so that you can enjoy the rest of your long weekend.
Basically, this is literally about what's taught in school regarding all that historical information that your favorite YouTubers are constantly talking about. So Senate Bill 3019, that's what we're talking about.
Revisionist history has been going on for a long time now. What we could do...
It's time to get savage again. Of 1,500 members, this statistical anomaly is mathematical evidence, period.
Shalosio Yatzarel.
Shalosio Yatzarel. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Unehiya, reporting live on behalf of the Great Spirit. Ayay, I share, ayay. To complete your awakening and to let you know that despite what they told you, your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness and your law is the truth, not theirs.
I want you to be able to make a comment. If you want to make a comment, you can, and you can do so the normal way, but you can also record yourself on your phone, make a YouTube short, upload it. As long as it's under a minute long, it'll be a YouTube short. You upload it to YouTube through your normal account, and then you grab that link and you can take it to the Unehiya page, the Unehiya movement page, and you can share it there with a direct message to the administrator. Share the link. A QR code, we'll put it right here so that you can see it, so that it'll help you get to the Unehiya page. You can use that QR code, or you can use the link in the description box to get to the Unehiya movement page. Share your link to the administrator for your YouTube short. And with that link, we will then take your YouTube short and feature it in a video.
I need all indigenous citizens of the U.S. to not just listen to what I have to say today, but also take action. After you see this video, I'm going to explain what's going on, and then I want you to join the Unehiya movement and share this with anyone who identifies as or gets identified as African American. That's how you take action on this, all right? There's a QR code popping up on your screen for that reason right now, and there's a link in the description that'll take you to the same place. This YouTube channel is directly affiliated with the Unehiya movement, and the reason for that is because I'm not just trying to be another guy talking about who black people are on YouTube. Real talk. Talk is cheap. Action is high value. Right? Okay, so listen. We cannot just sit idly by and watch videos of each other talking about our identity. It's good to understand the truth. Do not get me wrong. It's good to understand the truth. But we need to make our inner standing an outer standing by demanding recognition. And a lot of you probably think that that's not really a realistic option for us, but it is. That's where this bill comes into play. Senate Bill 3019. It's the Native Histories and Cultures Education Act of 2023. Before I unpack that, let me explain why you should even bother listening to me. I'm a career journalist, a news reporter. I covered President Donald Trump's first 100 days for USA Herald. I distilled American news for overseas English-speaking communities in the United Kingdom and South Korea. More recently, I covered political and business news for the Lebanon Democrat and the Nashville Post. I then became a member of the National Association of Black Journalists. I was being considered for a position with USA Today in early 2022, but withdrew from consideration to become a PR specialist for a national addiction treatment company that year because the salary was 50% higher and because my people have a tragically historic and unfair connection to the modern opioid epidemic. I now own and operate a digital marketing and PR firm. I say all this to say public relations, not just public relations, but yeah, public relations and news media, political news coverage are what I do. And I'm intimately familiar with how legislative procedure works, if that makes any sense. And I'm talking at the municipal level, the state level, and federal level, because that was my focus. That was the focus of my coverage in previous jobs. So as far as this bill is concerned, stay with me. As far as this bill is concerned, okay, listen. Democratic Minnesota Senator Tina Smith introduced the bill for its first reading on the floor as of October 4th, 2023. She's the one who replaced former Senator Al Franken of the Al Franken Show in 2018, when he got canceled for sexual misconduct allegations. Upon first reading, this bill was immediately referred to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Nothing else has happened yet with this bill, which is a very good thing because that means we're catching this bill extremely early. The general public has no clue this bill even exists yet because A, how early we're catching it, but also B, the fact that it's a low priority legislative action in the first place. It's low priority. These things are going to be critical to understand for effective legislative advocacy. Okay, so watch this. So Senate Bill 3019, that's what we're talking about. 3019 would be highly unlikely to ever get news coverage, whether it passed or not, and is highly likely to pass due to having no notable opposition from either party. I'm about to explain the bill itself, but I also want to explain that we're not advocating that it be blocked. We want it to pass, but we want to influence lawmakers to make a small yet massively significant amendment to the bill before it passes. In fact, preferably for us to have an ideal shot at success, we need to accomplish that before it can get scored by the Congressional Budget Office. This is something that we want to change so that then they can figure out what they're going to do. Then they're going to, by the time they've moved on to a step like that, we're past the Rubicon. So
Senate Bill 3019 presents us with a magnificent opportunity to rewrite history. Revisionist history has been going on for a long time now. We could fix it. What we could do, we could actually solve the problem of revisionist history and put the real history back where it belongs. Children could learn the real history in school. Keep in mind, education was what was used, weaponized against us to rob us of our identity. This is our opportunity to fix that. An amendment can be made to the bill if the proper evidence is shown that an amendment is necessary. We have a chance now to make our argument because the time to make an amendment to the bill is during these deliberative stages. And it's during these same stages that we can appeal to the lawmakers who are actually decision makers on the subject. We can change things using this bill. This bill is just an opportunity for us to make our argument.
Now, Senate Bill 3019 updates what the National Museum of the American Indian is obligated to do and provide for the sake of educating grades K through 12 on the histories of Native American nations and their cultures. Why does it matter what the National Museum of the American Indian does? It matters for three key reasons. Firstly, the National Museum of the American Indian produces the base curriculum for teaching Native American histories and cultures in public education nationwide. That base curriculum, as it's called, is literally a federally mandated common core, if you will, for what to teach in public schools about Native histories and cultures. And the director of the National Museum of the American Indian is actually in charge of overseeing the development and provision of that base curriculum. If you haven't seen your kids having to deal with this yet, I'll explain why in a minute. The second reason why this is so critical is because a lot of the research being conducted for the study of Native American histories and cultures is provided one way or another by the National Museum of the American Indian. Study programs at various universities and think tanks are currently conducting all that research with a bias against you that leads to excluding not just the Negro contribution, but more importantly, the Negro origin of Native histories from the traditionally accepted narrative. So they're excluding Negro everything from the mainstream narrative when they do their research, because the body of data and information and resources that the National Museum of the American Indian has informs all that research a certain way, in an exclusive way. So in other words, to sum up my last 2 points, basically this is literally about what's taught in school regarding all that historical information that your favorite YouTubers are constantly talking about. Remember, the mainstream consensus about black people in the United States and Canada who are neither immigrants nor descendants of immigrants is that we're Africans. That gets taught in school today and has been taught in school for many, many generations for obvious reasons.
The purpose of Senate Bill 3019 is actually just to update the obligations of the National Museum of the American Indian. They should not be able to update those obligations without adding the requisite obligation to acknowledge who we are.
I'm going to address the third reason why it matters what the National Museum of the American Indian does in a minute. But first, we need to address what's missing from that core curriculum and that background information for all that research, because as we all know, there are some very critical data points that we're all deliberately overlooking, and the National Museum of the American Indian needs to incorporate that data into its educational resources. That's what we want. They should not be allowed to update their obligations without adding an obligation to tell the truth about indigenous identity. So check this out. The Slave Voyages database provides estimates estimates for how many slaves went from any point A to any point B based on what research of the transatlantic slave trade has actually verified to date. You can sort those estimates so that you only see disembarkations, which means you're only looking at data pertaining to where slaves landed after actually surviving these voyages. You can also further sort that data by region on your x-axis, while your y-axis remains sorted by years in increments of 25 years from 1501 to 1875. So you end up with rows of total numbers of slaves within a given segment of 25 years and columns for each of the regions in which those slaves landed. That last row at the bottom, if you do this, as I've said, is for total numbers from 1501 to 1875. Basically the entire slave trade, okay? One of those regions will be labeled mainland North America. And when you look at this column's total, the number shown is 388,747. That might surprise a lot of Pan-Africanists and Afrocentrists in our community, and I want to make sure we all understand what that number means. This is the number of how many slaves were successfully brought to mainland North America from Africa over the course of 375 years. I'm going to say that again. This number, the 388,747 that you're looking at, that is the number of slaves. That's how many people were brought as captives, brought as slaves from Africa to mainland North America, period. This is how many people over the course of 375 years. This is the total for that entire period of time. Okay, almost 4 centuries worth of time. Now keep that number in your head, because I also want to show you how many of us were counted on the 1860 census. Remember, when we were just looking at this, we're just now looking at this, and we're seeing the range of time that we just looked at ends at 1875. 1875, right? We're gonna look at the 1860 census. So that would be the census right before the census that's right before that range of time ended.
Now I want everybody to remember the Emancipation Proclamation came in 1862. Slavery was abolished in 1865.
Okay, so let's look at this. This is this right here, what you're looking at, is a 20th century copy of the original 1860 census, and I'm getting it directly from census.gov. I'm taking you to page 9 of the introduction, where you'll see a figure entitled Census of Slaves and Free Colored. This is a table displaying Negro population data as of 1860. Don't forget, the slave trade itself had already been outlawed for Britain for decades by this point. As you can see, this table covers all of the U.S. censuses that had been taken so far, because the first U.S. census was in 1790. So we have 3 non-percentage categories. Those non-percentage categories are free colored, slaves, and then free colored and slaves. Right? So we got a free colored column, we got a slaves column, and then we got a column for combining free colored with slaves. As of 1860, there were 487,970 free coloreds, but there were also just shy of 4 million colored slaves. And that gives you a total of 4.4 million colored people, slave and free. Now compare that number to the 388,747 slaves counted coming from Africa. What we have right here, what we've just demonstrated, is a large data disparity between the numbers for slaves from Africa and for coloreds in mainland North America. The disparity in question is that 388,747 slaves from Africa over the course of 350 years only accounts for 9.8% of the 3,953,760 black slaves counted in 1860. A blaring incongruity only exacerbated further by the fact that at least half of that 388,747 captives from Africa died during those 350 years leading up to 1860. This statistical anomaly is mathematical evidence that strongly suggests the so-called African American demographic doesn't actually descend from those captured in Africa. The phenotype of this demographic also cannot be attributed to any groups from the African continent, because to assume that less than 10% of our population genetically determined the skin color, hair texture, facial features, and body proportions of the other 90% is tantamount to the tail wagging the dog. Therefore, it's only logical to deduce next that we are predominantly indigenous to the Americas. Why? Because there is no data available on how else we would have gotten here. You can't blame white America for lying to you about your identity either, because the information is available right here. It's publicly accessible, and all you have to do is look it up. Census data comes directly from the government, and the Slave Voyages database is an interdisciplinary multinational project sponsored primarily by the National Endowment for the Humanities. It involved several institutions, including the Emory Center for Digital Scholarship, the Hutchins Center of Harvard University, the University of California, Irvine, and the University of California, Santa Cruz. The website is also hosted by Rice University. All of these are trustworthy institutions, so our sources are solid. I'll do more videos to explain how and why the Negro identity has become so complex. But I want us to focus right now on this issue we're talking about and how it pertains to the bill that I'm talking about. Okay, let me finally give you the third reason why it matters what the National Museum of the American Indian does. Historically speaking, two societal institutions were leveraged against us to cause the erasure of Negro identity. All right, two societal institutions are most responsible for the erasure of Negro identity: marriage and education. I'll go into more detail on all of this in future videos, especially marriage, but the point is, we were educated out of our identity.
Some slaves were good workers and very obedient. Many took pride in what they did and loved their cabins and the plantation as if they actually owned them. Others were lazy, disobedient, and sometimes vicious. I wonder what kind of slave I would have been. I wonder if I would have been one of those lazy slaves who just were not willing to work for nothing, or disobedient because I just didn't want to be a slave.
We were taught to hate dark complexion, too. We were taught that darkness is synonymous with evil. We were taught to disavow Unehiya or Wakantanka and embrace God instead, and his son, Jesus, instead. Most pertinently, I don't want to say most importantly, but most pertinently, we were taught that we were brought here from Africa, and we were threatened against identifying as American Indians. In fact, during slavery and early abolition, we were denied any education at all. We eventually embraced African identity in a vain attempt to escape all the stigma attached to our Black Indian identity. Mind you, Native Americans were calling us African. Over time, we began to believe the lie. Native Americans are actually our mixed descendants with Europeans. And because they've been mixing with whites for so many generations, they no longer resemble the original phenotype. They also endured so-called Indian boarding schools, for which their children were often kidnapped and forcibly educated to forget who they were. That was the whole point. So you can't even fully blame the Native American for calling us African. That was a problem that they did that, but also they were forced to forget who they were, and by forgetting who they were, they forgot who we were. This only perpetuated a then growing sense of separation between mulattoes, who we now call Native Americans, and dark-skinned Indian kinfolk that they come from, who we now call African Americans, which is just a misnomer. So the same way education and the lack thereof has been weaponized against indigenous identity, we need to now weaponize it against harmful historical narratives. We need to beat people over the head with the truth.
The history of revisionist history among conservatives is convoluted and prolix. By now you know this.
Just look what happened a few weeks back when the president, in the midst of nationwide Black Lives Matter protests, announced plans to hold a rally in Tulsa on June 19th, a decision astonishingly tone deaf for two key reasons.
Next Friday, June 19th, is Juneteenth, an annual holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the U.S. As for Tulsa, 99 years ago this month in 1921, the city witnessed the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the nation's worst outbreaks of racial violence, recently portrayed in HBO's Watchmen.
Now, the reason they're mentioning Watchmen there is a lot of Americans learned about the Tulsa Race Massacre for the very first time, nearly a century after it happened, from watching that show. Basically, the night that episode airs, many white Americans went, holy shit, I had no idea this happened.
This also comes at a time that is rife with revisionist history, especially from the right. We are seeing that conservatives are torn over what the Civil War was really about. They're unsure. Well, as it so happens, the history associated with the Civil War, which apparently is debatable, can very much factor into this very conversation. The descendants of slaves have a hidden identity, and that identity needs to be revealed, need to be able to discuss who we really are, all right? And we need our cousins, we need Native Americans to do their part in telling the truth.
And Senate Bill 3019 is an opportunity to do that. The purposes of the bill directly open the door for an amendment because what we're proposing perfectly fits the description of those stated purposes. However, we have to do this right. The estimate of how many slaves were actually brought here from Africa, 388,000. In 1860, we see the colored population is at 4.4 million. Slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population. Unehiya. Its entire objective is to make an amendment to Senate Bill 3019. Shalosio Yatzareo. It's your brother, your cousin, your nephew, young Unehiya, reporting live on behalf of the master of breath, Hisaketu Mesi. Listen, if you are somebody who watches Unehiya, if you know that channel and you know its content, you are the type of person on whom this video will not be wasted. You will understand the significance of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Unehiya. Unehiya is an organization that advocates for Black Indians. They're in the middle of waging a political campaign right now. Its entire objective is to make an amendment to Senate Bill 3019. I've done a video already about that, and I want you to be able to check out this video if you have a chance. I want you to check out that video so that you can see the breakdown of what that bill is about and what's significant about it right now for us. But I'm going to give you the long and short. The gist of it is this. This is an organization that needs support for amending that bill because this is a way to get acknowledgement and recognition from the federal government of who we are. This is not something that comes with reservations and a check and all of that. No, we're not talking about getting a check. We're not even talking about getting land. This campaign is organized specifically for the focus of getting recognition for not only Indian freedmen, but we're talking about Black Indians who were never enslaved as well. I was a journalist for 7 years, and politics was my primary beat. I covered government at the state and municipal level as well as the federal level. I've seen how grassroots activism can actually impact the way a bill passes when it has not yet passed. This is a bill that has not yet passed. It can be amended before it passes, and that's what they're trying to do. If it is amended, then the changes are going to result in a change in educational curriculum as well as research resources in such a way that they begin to reflect the Negro Indian origins of indigenous people throughout the Americas. I want you to see the video that I mentioned a minute ago, because there's a lot more to it than that. Right now, what everybody is fighting for, and what Kurimeo Ahau talks about all the time, is recognition of the truth. That's what this is about. For Unehiya to get the support that it needs members. It needs a member base, and it needs you guys to be able to give whatever monetary support you're able to give. It may be small donations. If you can become a member, then that there comes a monetary support with that as well. And they need that because this campaign is costly. Any successful campaign to do something like this does cost money. And so there is going to be a need for people who are able to support a worthy cause. It's a time for us as a people to come together, put differences aside. We don't all agree perfectly on what our history is, and I understand that, but you got to put that aside and really think, do you or do you not want the real acknowledgement of who we are to come to fruition? Because it can be done, and there's ways to demonstrate it, but there's a lot of data that needs to be put in front of the right people. So that's what we need, and we also need a petition to be signed. So if you can sign that petition and become a member and be able to contribute to the movement, that's what Unehiya needs right now, and I'm doing my part as best I can to find the people who are willing to do that, because it doesn't really take that much of your time. Act now. Just as a quick recap, I want to show you guys how many slaves genuinely were brought to the North American mainland from Africa. Again, I've said before, this is not a channel where we just act like nobody was brought here from Africa. We just want to have a realistic understanding of how many people that actually was, right? So I'm showing you the Virginia Encyclopedia. I'm showing you an entry from the Virginia Encyclopedia, and it's showing, and the reason I'm showing you this is because it's giving you a range, the estimate of how many slaves were actually brought here from Africa, right? And that range spans from 374,000 to 388,000. Now, why does it matter that we're looking at the Virginia Encyclopedia? First of all, I keep showing y'all this on this channel from different sources. I want to show you different sources. In the video that I keep telling you about, but you need to go watch. You need to go watch that video where I break down what this bill is that I was talking about a minute ago, Senate Bill 3019. What I'm saying is I can give you multiple verifiable, trustworthy sources. What's important about these sources is that they are sources that the government agrees with. Why does that matter? Because these are things we can actually take to them directly and say, hey, you agree with us that this is how many people actually came here from Africa. Virginia Encyclopedia gives a range of 374,000 to 388,000. Slave Voyages database gives a specific number, 388,747. So check this out. When I give you that range, we're talking about how many there were brought from Africa to the North American mainland across the entire slave trade. From the year 1501 forward indefinitely. That's the total number. It's not that big. Okay, so 1860. In 1860, the census of 1860 shows us a population of 4.4 million. Not 1960, 1860, right? In 1860, we see the colored population is at 4.4 million. That's their own story. That's the mainstream narrative. 388,000 at the max. We just seen that from Virginia Encyclopedia. So how is it then that in 1860 you've already got 4.4 million colored people if the total number you had brought up to that point wasn't even 10% of that? We're talking about, I showed you in that video that I keep talking about, I showed you that the number you brought is only 9.8% of the number that's present as of 1860. So how is that possible? How did this population increase tenfold while you were still bringing them? Right? That's the question. That's the question. Okay. And mind you, that population, that figure, 4.4 million, that's the total number of colored people, both slave and free at the time. And emancipation is a few years out after this census. So emancipation has not happened yet at that time, right? Okay. So that being said, the aim that you're going to get from mainstream scholars, and I'm giving you this so that you can understand what the argument is. When you ask that question, mainstream scholars are going to typically say, well, there was an enormous birth rate for the colored population at that time, and they were able to increase tenfold legitimate just because that's just how many of them, that's just their astronomical birth rate. And that's the explanation. That is the explanation. So in this video, we're going to break down the birth rate. Okay? But keep in mind, everything I'm talking to you about, all of this information is about to be something that we want Congress to grapple with when having to deal with that bill I mentioned earlier. The answers to the questions we're currently asking are the exact facts and points that we're going to be making in a very detailed electronic delivery to Senator Tina Smith. All right. So there's an actual strategy in place. Unehiya is all on top of that. That's why we need to support Unehiya in doing that. First, we're going to deal with the birth rate. Let's deal with the birth rate. So listen to me. I want to talk about, just for a quick second, I want to talk about spiritual identity. I'm going to do a video about spiritual identity in the future. This video is not about that, so I'm not going to dwell on this at all. In fact, I didn't even want to mention it because because of the fact that I'm trying to keep spirituality out of this video, right? But the reality is, not enough of us who talk about being indigenous, not enough of us delve into the spiritual ramification of claiming our indigenous ancestry. But one thing I do want to point out about spiritual identity is that, in general, from a spiritual perspective, your identity is comprised of 4 generations. Your identity is comprised of 4 generations. And just so you know who's talking to you, I am a Creek Indian, primarily. I am also part Cherokee, as is very common among many of you, right? Right. So yeah, I've got some Cherokee blood going on. I am primarily Creek Indian. I have Creek Indian on both my mother's side and a tiny bit on my father's side as well. So bear that in mind as I'm saying what I'm saying. 4 generations make up your spiritual identity. That means you represent 8 bloodlines. You are the product of 8 bloodlines. And you don't even have to believe what I'm saying. Just check out what the significance of this would be, if you don't mind. If you are indeed the product of 8 bloodlines in particular, then what you have to consider then is this. It's not unthinkable that one of them would have a connection to African ancestry. And for me, that is the case. I have one bloodline out of the 8. I have one bloodline that does connect to the African continent. And I know what a lot of you are thinking. If you are the viewers of Kurimeo's channel, then you're thinking, now, come on now. No, listen. I know the ship. I know the name of the ship. I know the port that the ship that the ship disembarked from. I know the owner's name. I know the seller's name. I know the families of both. I know multiple families in the seller's family. I know multiple people in the seller's family. I know multiple people in the owner's family. Listen, I know this. I've done. My point is this. This is a thing that can happen. And what the mindset we've got to abandon is this notion that it's all or nothing. Stop thinking that it's all or nothing. Stop trying to get everybody to agree with you that only one thing happened to any one people ever. Are we more indigenous or are we more African? That's how you need to be thinking about it. When we get into talking about the birth rate of the colored population, using that as an explanation for how the entire 4.4 million colored population as of 1860 could have been a product of just the less than 400,000 slaves brought from Africa to the North American mainland. That is a very unlikely story, but in order for it to be true, the slave breeding part has to be true. Slave breeding is a hugely, massively important part of the narrative, the mainstream narrative. And it has to be more than just true. It has to be the norm across the board for the majority of slaves brought over here in order for us to be African in any large number. In order for us to have any significant component of our ancestry be from Africa, in order for any significant component of our ancestry to really be from Africa, we're going to need this slave breeding explanation to work. And I'm going to show you in a minute why it's so critical, why this is the only way that the mainstream narrative can work. And I'm going to show you what's wrong with it. But first, I want to show you this. You need to accept the fact that there are a lot of actual anecdotes and accounts of slave breeding having happened. So do not just immediately start saying, oh, no, slave breeding didn't happen. And for anybody who's confused about what we're talking about when I say slave breeding, what we mean is white masters impregnating enslaved women to create more slaves because we were experiencing what is called chattel slavery. If the mother is a slave, it is automatically legally the case that her child is a slave as soon as it's born. And that child immediately belongs to her master. That's how chattel slavery works. I've talked about that before. I'll talk about it more in the future, I'm sure. But slave breeding is the industrial production of more slaves by impregnating the enslaved women. And the mainstream narrative we've been fed is that white men would either rape them, or sometimes it wouldn't be rape necessarily, but they would take these women as mistresses. And I have a hard time believing that any of it was ever anything but rape. I just have a hard time with that, because if you're a slave, what choice did you ever have? You could not consent, right? But that's just me. Anyway, that's the narrative. And so a bunch of slaves, they're saying that our population multiplied by a factor of 10, because of how much all the slave owners were doing this with the enslaved women. That's wild. You understand how many more slaves were created here than imported here, right? By the mainstream narrative. And that's what we need to be analyzing. And I just want to say that the reason I brought up my own family is because I do have evidence of slave breeding in my own family. Only one instance, and I have yet to be able to verify if I am a lineal descendant of any person who was a product of that. There's a specific plantation that I'm referring to that my ancestors were on, and they deny that it ever happened. There have been DNA tests done to prove that people who look like me and have my last name, which is the same last name as the family who owned them, by the way, actually did have a common ancestor with white people who have my same last name. And we even have a suspect as to who that common ancestor must be. However, that plantation, the keepers of those grounds, today they continue to deny, no matter what DNA says. They deny that the very military man of a very prominent political family ever did what we're accusing of doing, which is this slave breeding thing. Also, there's reason to suspect that even doing it got him put in the doghouse by his own wife, which brings me to my point. How many white women were just being okay with this incredibly shameful thing happening? There would be enormous stigma to this if this is what was really going on. You understand that, right? But everyone who was owning slaves must have been doing it in order to affect the birth rate of the colored population the way you claim. We're about to get into the numbers to show you why I say that. We're going to look at a 2020 study that I think is going to shed, and it's very recent. It's very recent, right? 2020. We're going to look at a 2020 study that sheds a lot of light on this, done by a mainstream researcher who is considered an expert in his field. Let's take a look. I want to talk about J. David Hacker, Dr. J. David Hacker. This is a guy who's actually a professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. This guy, he's a demographic historian. All right. You can also say a demographer, but he's also a historian. Okay. So he is a demographer, but his expertise is not in the is not necessarily in the demographics of today. It's not necessary or in the demography of modern populations. It's in the demography of specifically 19th and 20th century populations. All right. So, in 2019, USA Today was doing something special to commemorate the 400th anniversary of slaves being brought to this country from Africa. USA Today came to Dr. Hacker at the University of Minnesota because they wanted to get some context to add to the story, the special story they were doing on this, right? And so they consulted him about how many total slaves ever actually lived in the United States. And he came to the conclusion that, you know what, there's actually not good literature on that. There's not good data on that. We don't actually know. And so he did his own research to come up with an answer for them so that he could put together what the data actually shows. And because he put so much research into that to answer in order to answer their question, the very next year in 2020, he published his research on that subject. And in the process of publishing that and putting it all together, there were some things he ended up having to admit. And so he published it in a very renowned academic journal called Slavery and Abolition. Slavery and Abolition is a British peer-reviewed academic journal, and it is published in London. Currently, the study I'm showing you that I'm talking about right now is hosted by the National Institutes of Health, which is not uncommon. It's very common for health for medical organizations as well as institutions concerned with medical science to be the ones who are very directly involved with the publishing and researching of demographic information. That is demographic information is commonly considered to be health information. So anyway, I want to read you a quote that he put in this research note. Quote, "Slave birth rates in the 19th century were very high, near a biological maximum for a human population." Near a biological maximum for a human population, end quote. Now, the reason he's saying that is because he is looking at all the data. He's having to pull all this data together in order to make sense of the mainstream narrative, right? And he's saying, wow, this is an almost scientifically impossible birth rate, because he knows how many were brought and he knows the time frame for bringing them, and the math is just very challenging to make sense of. And he concedes this in his research note as well, actually. This is why slave breeding takes on a much more important role once you understand that a demographer has to tell you that typically this is not how human populations can even grow. This rate that we're talking about, basically what we're saying is, in order for the mainstream narrative to be true, the colored population, who apparently was brought over here from Africa, and there wasn't a colored population here yet. What he's saying is they represent the peak of human productive potential. They have done what arguably it's possible that no other human population has done. And that's really the problem. The problem is he has no alternative. He has no alternative. That's the problem. He and all other researchers on the subject are forced, and have long been forced, to just accept the quote-unquote fact that, well, black people must have done the impossible. So now, therefore, we have to blame the only culprit we have, which is slave breeding. Slave masters must have done unbelievable work on these slaves to get them to reproduce at a rate that could make these numbers work. And speaking of things we don't know, I want to point out another thing, which is that in his research, in this study, in this paper that he has written, that he has published in Slavery and Abolition as of 2020, he uses a term over and over and over. The term is assumed birth rate. Assumed birth rate. Are you following me? He uses this term over and over because the birth rate we're talking about that's so astronomical and so unbelievable and so impossible, it is an assumed birth rate. It is. That's the point. That's part of the problem, is that it's an assumption. Now, we have to go with that assumption, apparently, because of course there's just no alternative for where all these black people came from. They had to have come from Africa, so we just have to believe that somehow the 388,000 max black people brought here from Africa must have swelled to this enormous number of 4.4 million by 1860. Throughout this study, he's actually letting you know that there are several decades in the 1700s and in the 1800s that actually give us numbers that are very difficult to believe. And he says in this paper that there's a large margin for error. There's a large margin for error. I'm going to read one of them to you real quick. He's saying, quote, "Given the large proportion of all slaves who were born or imported after 1750, however, estimates of the number of slaves who lived in the United States are robust to significant errors before 1750. End quote. That's huge. So all the estimates we've got before 1750 are unreliable, is what he's saying. Remember, we're only dealing with like a 350-year span of in the first place. We're talking about from 1619, round up, say 1620, to 1860, right? Well, from 1620 to 1750 is like 80 plus 50, that's 130 years. That's 130 years. 1620 to 1860 would be like 240 years. Or wait, it would be 1620 to 1820. That's 200 plus, that's 240 years. That's 240 years that we're talking about in that span. And within that span, out of that 240 year span, we're really talking about 130 years of it. 130 years, that's half of it. That's half. Half of that time is actually unreliably counted. The estimates we have are incredibly unreliable for half of that time. And keep in mind, we didn't even have a census until 1790. Then he also says, here's another quote, that to really drive the point home, he says, quote, "The most important assumption is the estimated slave birth rate in each decade." Listen, this guy was asked a question by journalists like myself. I know how this goes. We find you because of your expertise. We're looking for somebody to give us population data, and Minnesota, the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, actually has a population studies center. I don't know if I'm saying, I don't know if that's the exact name of it, but they have a population study center. And Dr. Hacker he's one of the experts there. So going to him is a no-brainer for a journalist who's looking for data on a population. They wanted to know, how many man hours did slaves actually contribute to the labor force of this country as it was getting off the ground? Because the point they're trying to make, I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to make a point that in this story, they want to make sure it's understood that slavery's been a big part of this country's narrative. We need to own up to how much we owe to slave labor. This country was built on the backs of slaves. And in order to make that argument, we need to talk about how many slaves there actually were, how much work they actually put in. Can we put a number to the man hours that they put in? And that's also something that he spends a lot of his time on his study answering that question. How many man hours slaves contributed, right? So he's demonstrating slaves built this country. That's part of the point here. But there's more to it than that, because in the process of asking that question, they need to ask it to the right person, and they find somebody who's at the Population Study Center from the University of Minnesota. Very few universities have a population study center, so this is perfect. Not only did they find an expert at the right institution, they found the right expert at that institution, because he's not just any demographer. He's a demographer who is a demography historian, and he specializes in 1800s and 1900s demography. Here's another point that Dr. Hacker makes. Dr. Hacker talks about the fact that in the Chesapeake Bay region, or in the Chesapeake region period, child-to-woman ratios leap wildly from the 1660s to the 1780s. So for a pretty long period of time, we're gonna say roughly, let's say 80 plus 40. That's 120 years. For about 120 years, big swath of time, child to woman ratio are leaping wildly. And you don't even have that much African slave activity in North America until the 1700s. Yet we're starting with this problem of child to woman ratios leaping wildly beginning in the 1660s. Before slaves were even being brought in any significant numbers from Africa to North America at all. It seems as though the Chesapeake region, where you have the Virginia colony, is seeing a bunch of female slaves having enormous numbers of children. Wild figures. And it's important what we see in the Chesapeake region, because for the same reason why I made sure at the beginning of this video to give you the Virginia Encyclopedia as a source for how many slaves were brought here from Africa to mainland North America. The reason it matters so much is because you've only got two main ports of entry into mainland North America for bringing slaves. Louisiana colony and Virginia colony. I want to pivot to Dr. Sarah G. McNeil at the University of Houston. She's a historian also, and she has a digital history platform that she engineered for the university. It's kind of dated now, but it's functional, and it has on it many cool resources that are very interesting. And one of them is the slavery fact sheet. It gives us this little breakdown of the slaves taken from Africa to let us know that 14% of the slaves brought from Africa were kids under the age of 14. And then 56% of the slaves brought from Africa were adult men. Only 30% of the slaves brought from Africa were adult women. Slightly less than a third. What's crazy about that is the fact that we just went over all this information from another expert explaining how the people brought here from Africa, their population somehow pushed the biological maximum for what they should be expected to do in terms of production, creating offspring. Dr. Hacker says a population of that size, let's say they had a normal balance, a normal ratio of male to female, it is already pushing the biological maximum for them to then swell to a number of 4.4 million in like 250 years. He's saying that's just crazy. And then we have this other expert who's saying, well, if you want to make it even crazier, guess what? They didn't even have enough women to pull that off. Now, we don't know how many of the kids who were under age 14 were female. We don't know what the ratio of male to female was for the kids. No way of knowing. Let's say split it in half, right? Let's say 7% of them, and I doubt this is the case. I imagine that it was more lopsided and that it was actually largely male. But let's say split it in half and say 7% of all the slaves brought from Africa were young girls. 7%. And we'll add that to the 30. That makes 37%. 37% of all the slaves brought from Africa were young girls. It doesn't really do enough to fix our problem. We need a very healthy ratio of men to women here in order to get the absolute best reproductivity out of this population. So when we talk about slave breeding, and again, we don't have anything more than anecdotal evidence of slave breeding happening. We know it happened because there are slave narratives that tell the tale, but we don't have numbers. There's not hard data on that. That's what we need. So I want you to get that and understand there is an alternative. The alternative is that these 4.4 million coloreds are mostly Indians, right? I do want everybody who's watching this to support Unehiya, as I already told you. I want you guys to be able to support Unehiya, because if you can support them with membership and support them because here's the thing, even as a member, yes, that provides some financial support a little bit, but also if they can get more members, they can get more people to do certain things. And one thing that we need is for people who have actually done some of their genealogical research and they've been able to actually find that evidence. If you've been able to find that connection of lineal descent, in fact, honestly, it doesn't even have to be lineal descent. I know that a lot of the tribes, a lot of the nations, the native nations today, a lot of them require lineal descent, or they're not going to count it, as if somehow you wouldn't be Indian, but your aunt would be, like, whatever. But anyway, the point is, if you have genealogical research that can demonstrate that you are in fact Indian, but you look
like me and people point at you and call you an African American. It would be good for them if you could kind of tell your story, you know, just about your genealogical research, the research you've done and what you've found. You know, they're not going to grill you on your records and stuff. And they're not going to require you to give out a bunch of names of living relatives or anything like that. They're not going to do any of that. They're not going to go through any of that with you. But they would like to get your story, because the more people we have to give their story, the better it's going to be, because there needs to be some actual testimonies from people. And some of you may not have found any evidence at all, but you just want to support, and that's perfectly fine. Please do that. Please support. Use the QR code and head to Unehiya and become a member as quickly as possible. We need you to become a member. We need you to become a member when they address Congress. Again, I know how this works. I know what they're trying to do, and I can assure you it's worth doing. And don't be one of those ones who just sits on the sideline because you're so cynical that you just don't believe that it's worthwhile to do any of this, because that doesn't make any sense. You want to watch videos like this, but you don't want to take any action. That doesn't make any sense. You got to actually do something, and there is something you can do. So this is what I'm talking about. Listen, Unehiya, they need bodies, they need members, and they need dollars, and they need signatures on their petition. So to become a member, there's two levels of membership. One of them is like $7 or it's like $6-7, and then there's another level of membership that's like $20. And that level comes with some obligations and some expectation that you're going to sit in on actual meetings. You're going to become like a kind of a stakeholder for Unehiya, and so they want to really you would kind of become one of the decision makers with that. Anybody who's able to do that, please do. But if you can at least, if becoming a member at all, even at the $6-7 level, whatever that is still a big help, and your membership is still a big help. But there's also, I'm going to leave a link in the description for their fundraising campaign as well, for anyone who's willing to donate more than that. More than those figures, more than $6 or $7, more than $20. If you're able to donate to this cause, this campaign, then you'll be doing them a huge service. We all have to just do what we're able to do. For those of you who are able to afford it, you have the money and the time to be a more involved member and maybe even a decision maker with Unehiya. Please do that as well. Help steer the ship, because they're looking for people who are informed, willing to be at the helm. Point your phone camera at it. Tap the link. It'll take you into your browser right to the page. Do what you got to do. It'll be super easy. Actually, I got links in the description for all this stuff that I talked about. But the most important link in the description, the most important link is for actually doing something, which is to make a contribution. I am grateful to the Master of Breath, Hisakete Messi. I am grateful that the ancestors have brought us together to kind of come to this realization at the time that we have in the information age. We don't have to agree on every little thing to make solid moves, all right? We can make moves even if we disagree. Let's just try and make sure that even if we're not exactly on the same page, let's make sure we're active. Let's be active. Let's be about that action.
I appreciate everybody tuning in, and I want to say to each and every one of you, Maro. Thank you so much, and that's a thank you to all viewers, Euro-American, African-American, Native American, everything in between, our entire immigrant community, all the immigrant communities, and And I just want to leave one other thought on your mind, which is for those of you who feel like people who look like me are sometimes infringing upon indigenous identity, and it's not fair or something like that. Maybe you feel the same way Jews feel, who hear people like myself who look like me claiming the biblical Israelite heritage. Please understand something you may not have thought about when it comes to the Negro is that the Negro was displaced. The Negro was removed from where he was supposed to be, and his entire environment was forcibly changed. His entire situation was forcibly changed. His identity, therefore, is incredibly difficult to track. It is incredibly difficult to trace. The identity of the Negro is unbelievably difficult to pin down. It is a moving target because of the transatlantic slave trade. Even those of us who were already here now have to prove that we were already here and not originally in Africa, which is unbelievably difficult to do. For many of us, it's not actually possible. So, everyone who participated in the slave trade owes the Negro an explanation. Don't get indignant if the Negro is claiming your identity when you erased any proof of who he actually is. Is it any wonder that he thinks he's you? Of course he thinks he's you. His path overlaps with yours somehow, and he has to figure out how. And if you listen to those who talk about these things, they have evidence to support what they're saying. How much evidence do you have to support what you're saying about him? Think about that. Every demographic that participated in any way in the transatlantic slave trade on either end or on the way, the middle passage, any of it. You owe us an explanation then. If you're upset that we believe we're you, then you need to solve the mystery. Don't get upset that I think I'm you. Okay? Don't get upset if I challenge your right to exclude me from your identity. That goes for Jews, Indians, and whoever else we claim to be. I could wake up tomorrow and claim to be white. If I have a reason and it's logical and you can follow it, then you need to sit down with me and have a conversation, not berate me for what I think. You owe me the conversation because you're the one who created the identity crisis in my community in the first place. It's your fault that I think I'm you, at the very least. And perhaps with that in mind, you should also consider the possibility that I'm telling the truth about these things. I, the Negro, might be any or all of these things. Some people are able to prove genealogically that they are Indian, but many people who look like me don't have the ability to do that because the vital records that they find don't reflect it. I found my vital records and was able to trace my matrilineal bloodlines to a reservation That's uncommon, somewhat uncommon in this community. Some of us cannot simply identify as Indian freedmen of a particular tribe because some of my people have not actually found the evidence genealogically. They haven't found the records, and they might not ever find it. But whatever tribe that is needs to come to them and explain it to them. The onus should not be solely on the shoulders of the Negro in the first place. Atonement. Atonement. Help the Indian, help the Negro discern what is true and what is false about his own identity. Some of us may genuinely be mistaken about something, but a lot of us, you will come to find, know what we're talking about, and you've just been unwilling to have the conversation that you owe us. Because it's your fault that we even have to have a conversation. Own up to that, and then help earnestly mend fences with the communities that have been harmed. That's all it's about. That's all it's about. All of it is said in love. We're just making a better America. We're going to make America great, one way or another. Peace.